Hello folks, welcome back to Reality Check with Arvind Swaminathan. I am Arvind Swaminathan. I hope you had a very happy Christmas and a very happy New Year as well. A little restricted perhaps, and I hope you had time to look at the other two videos of ours, History of Banking, Parts 1 and Part 2. If you haven't, may I suggest that you really do look at them, because from that we're carrying on today. Folks, today we're going to talk about not merely what has happened before, what we think is happening, but certain things which have remained out of the light. Some things which we call omission. Omission not by chance, but by planned omission. And this is where one has to begin to understand where this new world order came into being and how it relates with all this. It's important that we realize where it all started, where it began, and where it is now. It is important to understand something. First, the Templar Knights began their campaign. They began enlisting in the year 1118. The kingdom of Khazaria disappeared from the face of the earth in the year 1140. Its whole history is shrouded in mystery and secrecy. Nobody knows, and they've kept it that way. Where did those Khazars go? They were all fighting men. It had a very, very good, well-known, well-drilled army. Where did they go? I suspect many of them they gave up Judaism, adopted Catholicism, and enlisted in the Templar army, supposedly to defend the Holy Land against the Muslims. But we also know that these Templars always worked alongside Jews, certainly in France, certainly in Spain and Portugal, and certainly when they moved to England and Holland. Now, this is a very important link, because this is where much of what we're going to discuss begins. Once the Templars had moved from Spain and Portugal into England and Holland, they kept on going, they kept on getting richer, and you must understand that everywhere they went, whatever continent or whichever country, wherever they put down their flag, they said, "This is ours," which goes back to the Khazar Talmudic Judaism mindset, that whatever they take is theirs. And the pillage and plunder and loot they let loose everywhere, totally disregarding anything or anybody who lived there, because to them only they are human, nobody else is. And this shows up in what they did to the American Indian, what they did to the people of India, Africa, Australia, New Zealand, what they did to the Chinese and enforced trade on them on their own terms. Now, with this in view, what happened next? They become so rich, it was difficult to realize. Having pillaged and plundered and looted the colonies, was now moved into Europe. Why? A, it made them a lot of money. Every war was very big business. Second, all the colonies belonged to European powers. So whoever became the dominant power also took over the wealth of all those colonies. Now, having collected so much wealth, we have to start beginning to understand that all these secret societies existed. The most important ones being the Freemasons or the Masons. They went back a long way, but they were infiltrated by these Templar Knights. Or it is thought they became the highest of the highest orders of these Masons, Masonic lodges. The lower echelons, they're harmless people, but the higher ups, the 33rd degree, they're the ones whom we have to watch out for. But the problem is we don't know most of who they might be. We know some, but not all. And this is where the driving force for this new world order comes in. Now, these secret societies, not only did they exist, but you understand their importance. We've heard of the New World Order in recent times, say 1980, 1990, 2000. But in actual fact, it began in the year 1786. A man called Weishaupt in Germany began this thing and his Illuminati. Now this was a concept of total revolution where we would break down all civilized norms. There would be no marriages, no land holding, no land ownership, no ownership of anything. Women belong to everybody, according to Weishaupt. And this was the beginnings of communism. Now, whether Karl Marx knew about all this and therefore formulated his theories, we're not quite sure. But a lot of what he came out with started here. And this is where the omission begins. We know that the 19th century was the century of the Rothschilds. But who were the Rothschilds, and why is their name never in evidence, never known? It doesn't come up. It doesn't seem to come up anyway. Why was it omitted? The richest family in the world at the time, and nobody knew about it. Why? Because without that secrecy, they could never have achieved what they've done. Hence, keeping it secret was the key to this new world order. It started with the Illuminati. When Weishaupt died, it was taken over by Massena, which, as you know, is the person who started the mafia, or the earlier version, the Carbonari, in Italy. Now, who were the Rothschilds? How did they get in? We first hear of Mayer Amschel Rothschild in the 1770s, 1780s. A rich Jew. Some say he was a wine seller. Other stories say he was a pawnbroker and lived just above his pawn shop. Now, the pawn shop, being a Jew, would be more likely, because other trades, Jews were just not permitted at that time. Now, it's interesting to note that the name Rothschild is not a normal one, it's a made-up name. It means red shield. The original name was probably Bauer or Bear, which means from Bavaria. And the story began in Frankfurt. The house they lived in, Green Shield House, which is a semi-detached house. One side was the Rothschild, the other side was another banking family, the Schiffs. Now, Mayer Amschel Rothschild had 5 sons, and he trained them all in banking. But as a Jew, how did he learn banking? Which goes back to the Jews and the Knights Templar working together. That is probably that relationship where he learnt his banking, which he passed on to his sons. Having done that, he then sent them to different capitals in Europe. The eldest one stayed in Frankfurt. The youngest went to Paris. The third son, the most capable, went to London. That was Nathan Rothschild. The other 2, one went to Vienna and one went to Naples. These were the centers of most trade and most, how shall I put it, music, fashion, any culture, cultural activities. This is where these were the places to be. Now, having got to these capitals, what happened? The London arm developed this strategy of not lending money to individuals, which is what most Jews would have done, but to lend it to governments. That was not only guaranteed return with interest, but it also brought influence, as we'll see later. The London arm financed Wellington during these Napoleonic Wars. The French arm, Jacob Rothschild, he financed the French government and Napoleon. So it didn't matter who won. There was a heck of a lot of money to be made. Not only that, what about the other governments from Italy, from Austria, Germany, Prussia? It was virtually a European war, and they all needed war supplies. That means guns, gun carriages, armor, horses, uniforms, guns, muskets, musket balls, powder, and so on. There's so much, and food, because no army can march anywhere without food and such supplies. Now, where would all this come from? The Rothschilds. They were the only people who had this kind of money. And yet, with all this influence and all this money and all this, nobody heard of them. Why? This was deliberate. It was not oversight. Because again, without secrecy, they couldn't have done it. Not only that, it is interesting to note that the Rothschilds financed the Confederacy in the American Civil War. They offered to finance Lincoln also, but the terms were such that he had to refuse. You know what happened after that? He was assassinated for refusing. Not only that, the Rothschilds also financed probably the Crimean War. They certainly instigated and financed the Boer War, World War I, World War II, and the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Just as in passing, why was Kennedy assassinated? Because on his desk, on his return from Dallas, there were two memos which had already been signed. They just had to be issued. One taking away the power to print American currency bills from the Federal Reserve and taking it back to the American government. And the second was to get out of Vietnam. That would have meant absolute disaster for these bankers. He had to go. And believe me, he went. Now, having made so much money, you'll also find that the Rothschilds financed people like Cecil Rhodes. They financed the Rockefellers. They financed the Carnegies in their steel. They financed the Harrimans in their engineering works, the railroads. Wherever you look, you find the Rothschilds in the background pulling all the strings when it came to finance. Now these people, they know they can't step out of line, so they are part of the Illuminati or the New World Order. Now whether we like it or not, this is a fact. And yet, nothing happened. Nobody knew about the Rothschilds. Why? Their formula is, their name does not appear anywhere. All these things, all these organizations, there is a front man. For instance, until recently, we thought De Beers Diamonds was owned by the Oppenheimer family. It is, about 15 or 19% of it. The rest is owned by the Rothschilds. J.P. Morgan is thought to be the richest man in America. When he died in 1919, it was found he only owned 19% of the J.P. Morgan banking empire. The Rothschild owned the rest. J.P. Morgan had been the Rothschild agent in America ever since he got there. Which is why the Rothschild name doesn't appear anywhere. When they buy up something, the original name remains, except they own it. For instance, in the 1880s, Reuters was bought by the Rothschilds. We don't hear of that. Reuters then bought up Associated Press. The media is now owned by them. Here again, the whole concept of that world empire began, or the New World Order. It continued. It didn't begin here, it continued from 1786 onwards. You've got to understand that Weishaupt and Mayer Amschel Rothschild were also in touch with each other. And their first essay into all this was the French Revolution. One of their biggest things was depopulation. First, remove the aristocracy. Then They were hoping to bring the population of France down from around 25 million to about 6 million. Now you understand what I'm getting to. You'll find a little later on. This continued, this struggle between the American government and the bankers for the Central Reserve banking system. The first American bank sort of folded up around 1812. The second one continued, limped along until 1832, and I think President Jackson vetoed it. They didn't like it. He was very unpopular with the bankers, but it happened. And it was this same person who totally finished off or removed the American government debt. Probably the only president of the US ever to do so. Now, it took 147 years for that American debt to get up to $1 trillion. It took only another 4 to get up to $2 trillion. And the American debt keeps going up and up and up, because every dollar spent is a loan from the Federal Reserve, which is owned, again, controlling interest by the Rothschilds. Now, not only do they control the American government and its finance, but they also control every multinational company through the Bank of International Settlements, which is based in Switzerland. And every one of the transactions has to go through that bank, and they own the controlling interest. And Mayor Amschel Rothschild's boast or statement years ago, "Give me the power over a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws." The Rothschilds are still proving it today. Now, in 1908, a very secret meeting was held on Jekyll Island, which is just off the Georgia coast. A lot of these people were represented there. I'm talking about the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Vanderlips, and so on. And probably the Harrimans as well. Some of them were there in person, some their representatives were there. And this is where the present-day Federal Reserve Act was sorted out. First it became the Nelson-Aldrich Act, which was thrown out, and then it was renamed the Federal Reserve Act to make it look as if it was owned by the government. Obviously it isn't. This was eventually passed in Congress on Christmas Eve, when most people were on holiday. Now, whether it's been ratified or not by enough states to make it legal, we're not sure yet. But it's so secret that nobody talks about it. Now, the thing about that secret meeting was such that all these people represented there were bitter competitors in the American market. So what were they doing together? The Federal Reserve Act is the answer to that one. Not only did it give them the power of money, but these same people asked President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, to let the war in England continue a bit later on, once it began. Let it continue. Don't get into it yet. There was an ulterior motive. During this war, 1917, the Russian Revolution occurred. Now, it wasn't really a Russian revolution, but from all accounts, it was a Jewish invasion. You had a rebel army, which was 95% Jewish, armed with the most modern weapons known at the time, against a Tsarist army, which had muskets. And the Tsar wasn't even permitted to have access to loans for musket balls for those muskets. It was a walkover. And then what was inflicted on the Russian people over the next 60 or 70 years, it is believed that something like 60 million Russians lost their lives during that communist phase, because this is where communism began. You remember Weishaupt? This is where the first time it was inflicted on a people or a country. And the results were disastrous. No ownership of land, crops suffered, nobody had any incentive to produce or do anything. People suffered, they died of starvation. The Jews ran 95% of the secret services. There were purges. People died there. The Ukraine is another example. 1933 and 1934, something like between 6 and 8 million people died. They were either starved to death, worked to death, or just murdered. Now one wonders, the pictures we see about Jews in World War II, was it Jews in Germany, or was it people in Ukraine doing the suffering? It's an interesting thought. Think about it. Because most of the perpetrators of these heinous crimes were Jews. People like Genrich Yagoda, a man with a Hitler moustache. He himself was responsible for the deaths of between 8 to 10 million people in Russia. There's another one called Ehrenberg. Now, all these and a whole lot of others were mass murderers. And yet, we don't hear much about them. We don't hear anything about them. What happened in Ukraine is referred to by or among Jews as the Holodomor. Not a Holocaust, but a Holodomor, which they say, never remember it. As they say, the Holocaust, never forget. The Holodomor is something, never remember. They may talk about it themselves, but nobody else is permitted to even discuss it. So, now we begin to understand this diversion, why World War II had to be kept going, otherwise this may not have happened. Now the other thing is that much of Russian industry developed through American help via the Harrimans. Engineering came from there. Rockefeller was a big friend of Stalin. And Rockefeller, whenever he went to Russia, he was treated like royalty. So one wonders, have they been enemies all along, or have they been enemies on the surface, but hand in glove underneath? Another step in the scheme of things for the New World Order. You had to have access there. Otherwise the whole system breaks down. Then came the big collapse. But before that, to get America into World War I, Britain had to promise Palestine. To whom? The Rothschilds. Why Rothschilds? They were ensconced in Europe, in Britain. So why do they want Palestine? This is probably where the New World Order hopes to set up its world government. Even though we may think it is through UN. Again, the puppeteer will be a distance away from there. He will pull the strings from way behind the scenes. This has been the Rothschild formula, and it continues to be that. You see, until 1910, there was no corporate tax in the US. Until the Federal Reserve Act, there was no income tax in the US. Where would the money come from? The thing which the banks couldn't stand was the fact that most American companies financed their expansion out of their own profits. Now the banks could not allow this. Where would they make their money? How would they get these companies under their control? So, money supply money just flooded the market. How? They were printing the notes. They were printing the currency. So now companies were encouraged to take bank loans. And all their cash would be lying in these banks, which these bankers used to buy up all your media, your television, your radio, your periodicals, your newspapers. Wherever they could, whatever influence they could, they used it to buy all that up. Now, once they owned the media and the money supply, things began to take off. With women coming into the workforce, children could now be indoctrinated from a much earlier age. Here again, this was not enough. Money supply, they had to give them another shock. That is where the 1929 crash came in. Money was in very normal supply, huge supply, endless supply virtually. And people started buying houses, homes, new local businesses, and the stock market. Now, all of a sudden, what did the banks do? They reduced money supply almost by 30-35%. And the banks started calling in all their loans. Now, the law, according to those times, was that if a bank called in a loan, you had to pay within 24 hours. Distressed sales, stocks and shares were being sold for pennies. And people like Joe Kennedy made $200 million. How? He must have had a tip-off just before the crash came. He sold it off for hundreds of dollars. And he bought back those same shares for pennies. Added to this, once the crash took over, they did one other thing. They got the American government to make it illegal for anybody to have any gold in their possession, which had to be sold to the banks at $20 an ounce. And once this was completed, they took all the gold to Europe for safekeeping. After the war, Bretton Woods came in. Gold prices are fixed now at $35 an ounce. They brought it back and sold it and made a huge profit. Now, not only had they started buying up the media, they'd also started buying up the military-industrial complex, which meant every war that happened, they made money because the weaponry was in their hands. And they had to continue with these wars because all those weapons would go out of date or the shelf life would go. You had to use it up to get back a fresh batch. So you keep on getting wars all over the world. The Russian Revolution, World War I, II, Boer War, all these were diversions to take our minds off the New World Order. How many of us think about it? We don't. We think about today and tomorrow. There's a war on, we got to fight, we got to do this. Now, in the midst of all this, the American government planning was such that they were always looking for what they call a new Pearl Harbor. You had one in 1941, the whole of the world got together, the whole of America got together. Now you needed another one, not only to get America, but much of the world together as well. And how? Not just a new Pearl Harbor, but fear. You had to sow the seeds of stark fear in the whole world. So, you ended up with 9/11. They hadn't had a war for 10 years, equipment going out of date. 9/11 was a new Pearl Harbor. About 3,000 people lost their lives. And of course, if you look at it closely, you'll see it was engineered. That will be in the future. That's a different story. Now, the second Pearl Harbor was 9/11. What happened there? Was it real or was it made up? Was it engineered? And if so, who are the likely people involved? We'll discuss that in a different video. After this second Pearl Harbor, what was the next one? Fear was riding high everywhere. Terrorism succeeded. in establishing itself and spreading out all over the world where it had never been before. What was the next step? A third Pearl Harbor. Now the third Pearl Harbor, because the after effects of this war on terror is beginning to wane a little. Now to keep that fear going, a third one. Now Bill Gates in 2018 said the next one will be a viral attack, a biochemical or biological war. We now have COVID-19. Now, believe it or not, it is a war. It is a war on the world to sow and drive in that fear in our minds. What do we do? How do we get out of it? Plus, if people don't take it actively and they don't take it seriously, depopulation on a massive scale. Because this is one way where people will die, population comes down drastically, and what are you left with? Only those whom they want alive. Now we begin to understand the true meaning of the New World Order, where they have us by the throat and they do exactly what they please with us. Only those who they want will stay alive. The others are cannon fodder or fertilizer. They don't count. We don't count. We go back to the Khazars and Talmudic Judaism, which says only they are human. The rest of us are nothing. Now, what does COVID-19 mean? Billions, if not trillions, in vaccine and vaccine production. New strains coming out, so you'll need more and more vaccines. So some people get very rich. More important, the fear that has been driven into our minds with the war on terror gets even further and even deeper, because now you've got something which affects every single one of us. You can't get away from it, which suits the New World Order perfectly. Now you begin to understand what I'm trying to get at. Well, folks, I think we better close here. I hope whether you enjoyed what you've just heard or whether it's made you think, I hope it has at least made you think seriously. From my heart, I hope you really do think, because it is important for our future and future generations, if any. Well, it's time to close down. Ciao.